When I first started watching the UFC, there was this stigma attached to British fighters, and that was that they couldn't wrestle. If you watched fights like Michael Bisping versus Tim Kennedy, or Dan Hardy versus GSP, you could probably see where the stigma was coming from. But that's a bit unfair, right? Those guys were fighting elite grapplers. Plus, anyone who's followed Bisping's career knows he had some pretty high-level anti-grappling. What about the time Brad Pickett dominated future GOAT Demetrius Johnson in the WEC with some wrestling of his own? Does that not count for anything? I want to know once and for all, is the stigma true? Was it true back then, and is it true now? Patriotic bias aside, my assumption is that British fighters used to have below average wrestling, but that's no longer the case. I also assume British fighters have always had above average striking and grappling that's about on par with the rest of the roster. But what will the data tell us? To do this analysis, I've computed all the key stats relating to wrestling, striking and grappling, and I've compared how British fighters stack up against their non-British counterparts. Actually, I should say UK fighters, as I've included those from Northern Ireland as well. So let's get into it. Let's start with the wrestling. One of the biggest discrepancies we find here is the difference in average control time. UK fighters control their opponent for an average of 18% of a given fight, but are controlled for an average of 24% of the fight by their opponent. i.e., if a fight goes 15 minutes, we can expect the non-UK fighter to have a control position for 3 minutes and 36 seconds, and the UK fighter to have a control position for only 2 minutes 42 seconds. Interestingly, this is not driven by the UK fighter's inability to stuff a takedown. UK fighters stuff 62% of takedowns, which is about on par with the rest of the roster. One of the drivers behind the difference in control time comes down to offensive wrestling activity. Non-UK fighters shoot more on UK fighters than UK fighters do on them, which translates into more takedowns landed, which is shown here. One other factor explaining the discrepancy in control time is the difference in reversal rate. I wasn't sure whether to classify this as wrestling or grappling, but regardless, UK fighters only hit reversals on 9% of the takedowns they suffer, considerably lower than the 12% reversal rate of their opponents. Sticking with the grappling stats, UK fighters also have a higher submission loss rate than they do win rate, likely a result of the control discrepancy. So this really hasn't painted a rosy picture, but fear not, there is good news for UK fight fans watching. Let's turn our attention to the striking stats. Although UK fighters throw and land less strikes overall, those that they do throw and land on their opponent are more likely to be significant, which is shown here. To be honest, the difference does seem negligible, but when you examine the knockout rate, you start to see a more pronounced difference. UK fighters knock out their opponent in 31% of their wins, versus being knocked out in only 26% of their losses. Of course, this is at least partly explained by the UK fighters' lower propensity to submit their opponent, but it's also explained by more effective striking. When you look at the number of total strikes landed and the number of stoppages related to strikes, we find that strikes landed by UK fighters are much more likely to result in a stoppage. So we've got a summary of UK fight stats, and you could probably make the argument that perhaps the stigma is true, the data reflects a weakness in the wrestling. And to be honest, it's not really surprising. Wrestling and grappling are not part of the culture here like they are in places like the US, Russia and Brazil. But times have changed. The modern British fighter is a different breed. We have the likes of Tom Aspinall, Leon Edwards, Arnold Allen, Lerone Murphy, Paddy Pimblett, Nathaniel Wood. I don't think anyone would say those guys have a glaring weakness in their wrestling. But does the data agree? To answer that, I took some of the key stats mentioned earlier and checked to see how they looked before and after 2016. One of the biggest changes we observe is in the average control time enforced by their opponent. Pre-2016, we see UK fighters controlled for an average of 29% of the fight. When looking at the last 10 years, this drops to 21%. The stuff rate and reversal rate hasn't improved, so this doesn't explain the reduction in control. The main driver appears to be a large reduction in the number of takedowns attempted by their opponents, dropping from 5.25 per 15 minutes to 3.75. Why this happened is not entirely clear. It could be that UK fighters have improved the threat of their own takedown, as we see them shooting and landing more takedowns on average. though this hasn't translated to an increase in control time, which still sits at 18%. The threat of submission has also marginally improved, which could deter shots. The submission win rate hasn't significantly increased, but the success rate of submissions attempted has, which is shown here. Perhaps it's that UK fighters have moved away from a boxing heavy style, adopting more of an MMA base, which leaves less openings for takedowns. Perhaps it's improvements to fence work. Perhaps it's more effective striking. Significant strike accuracy does marginally improve. Let me know your theories in the comments. Whatever it is, I think we can somewhat dispel the stigma that Brits can't wrestle. All of this culminates in the best stat I have to share with the UK viewers. The win rate for UK fighters before 2016 was sitting below average at 49%. It jumps up to 55% if we look at the last 10 years, meaning we must be doing something right. So there it is, my friends. Hopefully you enjoyed that. I can see from my stats on YouTube that I've got quite an international audience, so let me know in the comments if you want me to do another country or region. Shout out to those of you who gave me love on the last video as well, I really appreciate that. Check out my video on how size influences submissions in the UFC if you haven't already, and hit subscribe if you want more.